Ladies and gentlemen, the many distinguished guests here, visitors from New Zealand. I need someone who will clap at the end. Leadership of the Liberal Party, MPs and supporters of the Menzies Centre, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this impressive institution and its supporters. And can I acknowledge Josh's warm welcome? It's a bit better than a rude one I received at home recently, where a younger person got up and said, "We tried really hard to get the Prime Minister, but we got you." Of course, many of you won't realise that Josh's eloquence and persuasiveness was learned from the Kiwis who hired him and looked after him and developed his potential in Deutsche Bank. Many of whom I know, very competent individuals, and I'm sure they're pleased with your success, Josh. It is a real pleasure to be here because what happens here and what people are thinking in Australia affects New Zealand profoundly. That's why I visit regularly and talk to as many people as I can and follow Australians' somewhat more feral politics than New Zealand through your media daily. I want to acknowledge the warm relationship shared between our respective governments and particularly the personal and political engagements we've had with Prime Minister Abbott and Treasurer Joe Hockey. Josh mentioned the way New Zealanders see Australia as a benchmark, and it's always been a challenging one because Australia has enjoyed 25 years of solid economic growth, a period where New Zealand has suffered through 3 significant recessions. Following the end of the mining boom, we believe that Australia is well placed to make the necessary adjustments and continue that run of solid growth. Australia is New Zealand's most important trading partner, as we are a surprisingly important trading partner of Australia, and Australia is our biggest source of overseas investment. It's also where many New Zealanders have come to live. A net outflow, that is, until the last couple of months, when for the first time since 1991, there was a net migration flow from Australia to New Zealand. Now, it was only 130 people. And as Deputy Prime Minister, one of my jobs is to welcome each one of them at the airport. Now, I want to acknowledge my wife, Dr. Mary English, who told me not to tell you this little story, but like many New Zealanders, we have family on both sides of the Tasman among our 6 children. One of whom couldn't get into medical school in New Zealand, but he did get in Australia. It's also a pleasure to be following in the footsteps of Prime Minister John Key. He is the outstanding New Zealand political leader of recent decades. He brings to bear a remarkable combination of analytical and political skills with an ability to instill New Zealanders with confidence that no leader in my lifetime has had. And we've needed that through tough times. And I know John Key has a huge amount of respect for John Howard, often quoting to me the policies John Howard told him won Australian elections. And I share that respect. I followed John Howard's career from a young age through the pages of the Bulletin, which was subscribed to by my parents in our farm in the far south of New Zealand. My first substantial conversation with John Howard was in extraordinary circumstances. I came over here to Australia to meet him in May 2003 as leader of the opposition National Party. Unfortunately, my visit coincided perfectly with the resignation of the Governor-General of the time. John Howard clearly had a bit on his plate. I expected my appointment to be cancelled. So I went along to question time to watch the Prime Minister answer questions in a very sombre Parliament, only to find afterwards I was summoned to his office, greeted warmly and treated to a 45-minute relaxed, wide-ranging conversation about politics. That afternoon I could not have been less relevant to his duties as a leader, but I could not have been treated more warmly and respectfully. It was a real boost for a young opposition leader, and I've always remembered his personal generosity. Unfortunately, his wisdom and guidance was not sufficient to prevent me losing my job a few months later. But John Howard's example showed me that in politics, persistence is rewarded. As the Prime Minister says to me regularly, if you wait long enough, you get your turn. So here I am, part of a successful government that's just won its third election with record levels of support. Tonight I want to offer some thoughts about the business of government, that is, the way government runs itself from a centre-right perspective. Others can determine whether these thoughts are applicable elsewhere, in Australia or anywhere else, because each country has its own set of circumstances. And I must stress the peculiar circumstances of New Zealand are distinctive from Australia, and that is a deep recession in 2008 and 9, followed by an earthquake, the repair of which is costing 20% of GDP. Australia has not had those decisive events that make the public pragmatic. A guiding principle of the John Key-led government has been to take the public along with us as we make changes, explain the reasons for those changes well in advance, lay out the logic in a way the public can follow, adjust expectations, and then put a big premium on implementing those changes competently. Somewhat easier when we don't have a federal system. Over time, this method has built popular support for our changes, which leads to the important result that they are likely to stick. This approach was developed partly from the experience of the national government of 1990 to 1999, of which I was part. In the early 1990s in New Zealand were a time of extensive, sometimes chaotic, and often unexpected changes in New Zealand. We implemented then as a government sound policies, but we failed to build a broader constituencies for those changes. As a result, we lost support. The electoral system was changed from first past the post to MMP, a completely proportional system, and we suffered the pain of watching many of our policies undone by a coalition later in our time in government and completely undone by the subsequent Labor government. That is one of the reasons why, since our election in 2008, we've taken a different approach. So over the past 6.5 years, we've been able to implement sound centre-right policy, which is now sufficiently embedded with broad public support that I'm confident it will remain in place whatever our political fortunes. Our approach has been dubbed, as pointed out in your publication, incremental radicalism. This differentiates it from another approach to centre-right reform, which I call crash or crash through. And I think we're all familiar with the elements of it, certainly I am, from our experience in the 90s. That is, creating a burning platform, initiating rapid change, spending large amounts of political capital, which you hope you will recoup when the expected benefits flow through, and that the benefits will be sufficiently strong for the government to be re-elected. And in some circumstances this has worked. In New Zealand in the 1980s and early 90s it was necessary. But we didn't have that choice in 2008, and it's certainly not John Key's style. Our MMP proportional system ensures that electoral success always comes down to a few seats in our parliament as it does in your Senate. In last year's election, we beat our main opponents by 47% to 25%. But our four-party coalition has only a working majority of 2 in the House. This means we have had to learn how to build and maintain continuous public support for our policies. For instance, we've kept a tight rein on new spending, and in fact having 2 budgets in a row where there was no new discretionary spending. But it hasn't felt like a campaign for austerity to the public. For instance, we increased welfare benefits for families with children in our most recent budget, the first increases in 40 years, over and above inflation. But that was within an overall spending increase very slim by historical standards. In 2010, we implemented the tax package that was referred to early, a revenue-neutral tax switch, which cut all income tax rates. 70% of New Zealanders have a top marginal tax rate of 17.5 cents, and the company rate, funded by a comprehensive GST at 15%, and some increased property taxes. And in that instance, a major tax reform in the midst of a recession, we spent a long time publicly working through the issues with a pretty simple slogan: things we don't want more of, we will tax more, property speculation and consumption, and things that are good, we will tax less, work, investment, exporting, savings. So they were largely uncontroversial by the time we finalised them, somewhat to our surprise. And people could see that the measures had been thought through and were balanced and fair, even if they disagreed with them. We've recently had our own positive experience with selling 49% of 3 government-owned electricity companies. We laid that plan out to the public at the beginning of election year 2011 and campaigned on it transparently and loudly all year, because the legacy of previous asset sales and privatisations was that New Zealand is one of distrust. That is, what they've disliked about the policy most is it's happened when they didn't expect it to, rather than the sales of the assets themselves, and so we had to establish a mandate. In fact, opinion polls showed pretty consistently 60 or 70% of the public opposed to the policy, but there was no evidence that it affected our support at the 2011 election. These 2 instances, among many others, show, I think, another aspect of the way we have conducted policy, and that is to respect the public's ability in the right circumstances to grasp sometimes complex policy trade-offs. They did grasp the significance of a more efficient consumption base for taxation with less disincentives around income tax, for instance. But of course, to achieve that, we have to be predictable, consistent, transparent, and upfront with voters. So I think you can see our fiscal policies and microeconomic reforms are familiar centre-right approaches adapted to New Zealand's particular circumstances. But it's the third part of our policy program I want to concentrate on tonight, and that's our reforms of the public sector. Like most developed countries, excluding transfers, government and the business of government make up a quarter of all economic activity in New Zealand. And of course, in our single jurisdiction system, the New Zealand government has federal government revenues and state government responsibilities. So government is a huge diversified business, and we can make a big contribution to the country's prosperity by running that business more effectively. Centre-right parties, of course, tend to want to limit the role of government, which they believe holds back growth in the economy and undermines individual and community liberties. I share that view, and the longer I'm in politics, the more strongly I hold that view. However, because of their scepticism about government, centre-right parties can underinvest in understanding how government works, with a tendency to regard it as a job the left know about, and therefore can underestimate their ability to improve the economy by understanding and improving the business of government. I believe in smaller government, but I also believe the best way to achieve smaller government is better government, and I'll explain that. The centre-right toolkit has traditionally focused on reducing levels of spending. We are now focusing on addressing, rather than that, the long-term drivers of that spending. Because unless you address the drivers of the spending, you can't permanently reduce levels of spending. Because too often spending cuts are only temporary. They are reversed often in the face of public opinion or reinstated by an incoming government. What is less intuitive for a centre-right party is to better understand that the drivers of government spending are the lives and needs of the government's regular, long-term, expensive customers. And I use the word customers advisedly because it irritates people. When government does its job well and intervenes effectively, it enables these vulnerable people to increase their resilience, their social mobility, their capacity to participate, and it assists them rather than undermines their ability to make positive changes in their lives. And when we do that, we reduce demand for public services over the medium to long term, and that saves taxpayers money, because it is the expensive interventions into complex lives that underpins tax rates alongside obligations for pensions. If I can sum it up this way, what works for the community works for the government's books. If you compare it to the private sector as we do, a business needs to understand its customers because they drive its revenue. In government, we need to understand our customers because they drive our costs. Like a business, it makes sense to get to know our most expensive customers. Their lives are complex and challenging. Their interactions with government agencies are usually chaotic, crisis-driven, and therefore very expensive and often, too often, ineffective. So we're starting to dig into these costs, and the information is proving to be a powerful driver for institutional and policy change, and ultimately a driver for smaller government. We can now pretty accurately predict the likely life path of different groups of children, for instance. For example, in New Zealand, there's a relatively small set of children with multiple problems from whom we can expect that 3/4 of them will not get a high school qualification, 4 in 10 will have been in the welfare system for 2 years before they turn 21, and 1/4 of this group will be in prison by the time they're 35, and that is the most expensive failure you can imagine. Each of these children will, in today's dollars, in this group in New Zealand, cost taxpayers on average $320,000 by the time they are 35. And a significant proportion of them will cost more than $1 million, which means we know at the age of 5 who our $1 million customers are likely to be. Now, government doesn't actually know that. Frontline workers in the community will know pretty much the names of these individual children. And in this group in New Zealand is 1% of a cohort. That is 1% of 60,000 children born a year. We can deal with them one by one. And if a proportion of them are going to cost $1 million, then it's worth investing quite a bit for effective interventions. Because the ideal outcome for us as a government is fewer customers. Not more and not the same number. Fewer dysfunctional families, fewer parents who spend decades on welfare, fewer people who commit crimes. Sometimes I wonder whether the post-war welfare state was set up to service misery, not to reduce it. Part of our response, of course, as a centre-right party, is to recognise that almost anyone can do more for themselves if it's expected, if they have the opportunity, and if they want to. We expect more from people because ultimately we believe they are capable of responsibility for their own lives and responsibility for their own families. And we disagree with the traditional analysis of the left, which is an analysis of helplessness in the face of overwhelming forces that cannot be changed. So we expect parents to actively support their children at school. We expect prisoners to get off drugs and gain work skills. We expect young sole parents who are on benefits to get qualifications. And we expect the public services to help them achieve those things. But to achieve that, we need to organise our responses around these individuals and their families, with them at the centre of public spending. That is, a customer-focused service. Inconvenient as it might seem, people don't live in government departments. They don't live in health, in education, in welfare. We wish they did. It would be a lot easier. That's where government lives. And that's how government defines itself. But our customers live in a messy world of families and communities and unpredictable consequences. So last year or a year or two ago, we got our officials from health, education, welfare and justice, the traditional silos of government, to bring along a summary of analysis about at-risk children and youth. What we saw was what we expected to see. 4 well-crafted ways, all different, for analysing exactly the same people. But the way of analysing was all quite different because each agency has its own institutional history, its own group of professional interests that it needs to service, and the culture that goes with that. And by way of example of the sort of thing that drives politicians crazy, one of them uses a deprivation index that goes from 1 to 10, and the other uses a deprivation index that goes from 10 to 1. The same kids in the same community are 10s in one agency and 1s in the other. Well, that sort of issue is probably easy enough to fix. What's more difficult is to set up the structures that recognise people's problems are connected by the fact that they have individual paths through life. Take the case of the 5-year-olds we've been talking about in state care. In New Zealand, there are about 1,500 of them each year, and by the time they are 35, they will incur prison and welfare costs totalling $550 million in today's dollars. So that's 1,500 5-year-olds who we know will cost $550 million. which in New Zealand is a lot of money. Traditionally, we've looked after these kids on a shoestring budget. If they had cancer, they'd get fantastic care. But because they have come from violent households and have psychological issues, we leave it to valiant efforts of foster parents getting $30 or $50 a week and frontline social workers under-equipped to deal with continuous crisis. So the question is, what can we do differently now to spend up front to reduce the chances that those children will have the life that is predictable and therefore save a good portion of the $550 million of future costs? And of course, we could specify dozens of other groups with similar dynamics. And we found that when we asked the question, what of government officials, public service, what would you do now if money was no object? They don't know the answer because they've used shortage of money as a reason to not really think that hard about solving the problem. They've thought only about how to get a bit more money to keep servicing it. We are starting to link these issues together. For instance, in this case, foster care, education, welfare dependency, youth justice, and prison sentences, because that's the life path these individuals will follow. And look really hard at the costs and the potential for more effective intervention at multiple points along that child's path to adulthood. We are prepared to spend money now, and more of it, to secure better long-term results for the most vulnerable New Zealanders, and therefore lower costs to government in the future. We call this social investment. And it is a deep-seated challenge to a lot of the structures that have been set up to manage government spending on an annual basis. Because as you can imagine, it takes more than an annual effort to have an impact. If there's enough good quality data, the investment approach can look out 20 or 30 years and model the costs of dysfunction, the benefits of intervention for particular communities and populations. And that is how we are approaching the welfare system. And we look forward to ongoing discussion with the Menzies Institute about their focus on welfare. Because we have had traditionally the post-war welfare model. That is a cash-driven, point-in-time view of the welfare system where the answer to every problem has been more money. I've now adopted the motto, the habit, that when officials come and ask me for more money, it's almost certainly an indication of failure, not success. Because if I'd believed what they told me about the last 15 programs, we would have no problems left in the world. They would have all been solved. It is a fundamental incentive in our system that failure is rewarded with more resource consistently for the last 50 years. So a couple of years ago, we commissioned actuaries from Australia, as it happens, Taylor Fry, to calculate the lifetime welfare costs of people in our welfare system. That turned out to be $78 billion in today's dollars, just under 40% of annual GDP. That is, New Zealand taxpayers will pay $78 billion, 40% of GDP, to sustain the current 1 in 10 adults who are on welfare. But we discovered some other interesting stuff. We discovered that those on an unemployment benefit make up only 4% of that future liability. Groups you haven't thought about much are much more significant than the unemployed. One group who were completely invisible to us before, we call recent exits. That is, people who have recently returned to work after being on a benefit, traditionally regarded as a measure of success. But in fact, they have a very high propensity to come back onto welfare benefits. And the logic is clear: the younger they start, the higher that propensity. One of the most critical things any welfare system can do is stop young people getting on a benefit. It's a drug. It's a drug. It turns out that many of them come back and their long-term cost was much higher than those people who are currently on the unemployment benefit. Sole parents have an even larger lifetime liability, as you might expect. And then there's another large group of people with psychiatric and psychological conditions, generally under the label of disability. In New Zealand, we have a group of 50,000 whose average length of stay on benefit is 22 years. What sort of a life is that? 22 years on the lowest income that our communities can provide. And now we can drill down further. Among sole parents, for example, you think in that group who is going to cost us the most money, and it turns out it's those who go on to a sole parent benefit before they turn 20. In New Zealand, that person has an average length of stay of 20 years on welfare, with a net present cost of $213,000 per person. That helps us know where to focus our efforts. The next obvious question is, well, what are we going to do about it? With that group, we no longer do what the lazy welfare state has always done: put some money in their bank account and hope they make it. And of course, many don't. We now enrol each one of them individually in a scheme which, among other things, ensures they are in school or training, provides a contracted supervising adult, and manages some of their money for them. This program is showing promising results. For reasons we don't quite understand, the number of sole parents under the age of 20 has halved in New Zealand in the last 6 years. We're also much more focused on getting them into work with extra support alongside greater work obligations. We update our valuation of the welfare system every 6 months. In the last 6 months, in the last year, it's reduced by $7.5 billion. Around $2.2 billion of this is due to steps we have taken as a government, about a 3% reduction. In human terms, what does that mean? There are now 43,000 fewer children, or 20% fewer children living in a benefit-dependent household than 3 years ago. And the number of sole parents on a benefit is the lowest since 1988. And we know from our forward liability the benefit of that will still be flowing through in 10 and 20 years' time. Of course, there are other areas where there's a role for better data and better use of data. We have to manage privacy and confidentiality issues very carefully, but there's no doubt that data and the technology of today around big data gives us an opportunity to drive a program of work that is firmly focused not on servicing our welfare system or our social dysfunction, but on getting better results. I must say, as a finance spokesman, it's a challenge to public accounting. One of the reasons our system is organised in the silos that it is, regardless of our customers, is the constitutional requirement to be accountable to Parliament. The traditional public finance structure is designed to track where a dollar goes. It was never designed to find out whether it made any difference. And public sector accountability is about tracking money, not measuring impact. Of course, impact, making a difference, is the whole point. So too often, as we know, and all politicians are involved in this game, success is defined politically as spending more money. Politicians say, look, we spent more, you know that we care. However, our public services are full of good, capable people, but unfortunately they spend a lot of their time unsure of the effects of what they're doing, and you should try it. Ask your public services if they know who gets their services and what impact they think those services are making, and probably they won't be able to tell you. And that's a bit unfortunate because the public think we know what we're doing. And they've mistaken good intentions for real impact. Borrowing and committing billions of dollars on good intentions has been the post-war model of public services. So the direction we're moving in, where possible, is to purchase results. And in fact, we publish results on the government website, updated every 6 months. There's 8 of them, and a lot of them are pretty tough, like reducing the incidence of child assaults. No one quite knows how to do that, despite hundreds of millions being spent on family violence. So we want to buy reductions in recidivism, which runs at 60% in most prison systems. How expensive a failure is that? My own view is we send young offenders into prison as undergraduates and they come out as PhDs in crime. We want to buy more educational achievement and lower levels of welfare dependency, and we want to broaden the range of organisations and providers that we buy these results from. What's become apparent to us is what a good centre-right think tank would know intuitively. Government doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas for public services. In fact, much of government's thinking is drastically confined by the culture of professional groups and interests and the definitions of knowledge that bureaucracies control. They only want to know particular things in particular ways that will do a passable job of services, but also meet the interests of the organisation. So we're aiming to democratise the availability of data and information about our customers so that more people and organisations outside the usual public policy process can analyse what we analyse and develop new ways and probably more community-driven and more effective ways of reducing dysfunction among our most vulnerable customers. That, of course, has the potential to disintermediate a substantial amount of the policy-making process of the development of the government of a modern developed country. Because with today's technology, the combination of mobility and big data and data analytics, anyone can know anything, anywhere, now, for nothing. That kind of knowledge used to require specialised bureaucracy. Why shouldn't someone with a disability, for example, have access to comparisons of different employment support services? Why shouldn't they understand the financial incentives being applied to the person providing their services? So our social investment approach actually is not a profound new theory. It's based on common sense and working models that just may not have been applied directly to all public services. People have talked about having a results focus for years in public services and taking a cost-benefit approach. It's probably taught in all good public policy services, but it does take a great deal of political will, because the difficult part is putting these ideas into practice in the messy, contentious world of government, and in particular, overcoming bureaucratic inertia and competition for resources. The social investment approach won't be suitable for all public spending, but we are rolling it out as far as we can and now building it into the heart of our annual budget process. And this is an opportunity for the centre-right to reform the way government works and deliver smaller government by delivering better government. Parties to the left of us appear to have given up on innovation in public services. Certainly that is the case in New Zealand, where the Labour Party consistently argues for the status quo. Centre-right governments, therefore, have the opportunity to have a more progressive, innovative attitude about public services, because voters at large will support public services if they make a genuine difference to those people with the least resource and the least hope, and if you are willing, able and accountable to a public who can see whether you've made a difference. We have been willing to say where we haven't, where it's complicated, where there isn't progress, where we failed. And I believe that if we focus on that difference in the next 10 years, we can change government significantly. But more importantly than that, we can, with our understanding of the freedom of the individual and the power of non-state actors in our community, build on the resilience and aspiration not just of those who are recognisably on middle class incomes or running their own business, but also those who are excluded from the economy and the community by a passive, unaccountable and lazy welfare state. Thank you.